The whispering shadows. It all began with a letter, neatly folded, sitting atop a package on my doorstep. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink slightly smudged as if written in haste. I wasn't expecting anything. To the owner of this house, it read. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around. The street was unusually quiet for a Friday evening in my suburban neighborhood in Oregon. The autumn leaves swirled around the porch, their rustling filling the eerie silence. Inside, I set the package on the kitchen table and hesitated. There was an undeniable weight to it, heavier than it seemed. Something about it felt wrong, like the universe was whispering a warning I couldn't quite hear. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was an old, dusty mirror. The wood frame was intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. At the bottom was another note. Do not look into it at night. My first thought? A prank. My younger brother had a twisted sense of humor, and this felt like one of his elaborate setups. But he lived in another state, and the mirror looked ancient. Too real for a joke. Curiosity got the better of me. I placed it on the mantel in the living room. It was smaller than your typical wall mirror but big enough to catch reflections clearly. That's when I noticed something odd. It didn't reflect the room properly. The couch in the mirror wasn't my couch. The lamp wasn't my lamp. And the reflection of me? It was slightly off. My smile looked too wide. My eyes stared back with an intensity I didn't recognize. Shaking it off as my imagination, I went about my evening. That night, I woke to a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind. But the sound grew louder, forming words. Help me. My heart hammered against my ribs. The voice was coming from the living room. Grabbing my phone for light, I crept downstairs. The house felt colder than usual, the shadows longer and darker. When I reached the living room, the whispering stopped. The mirror sat on the mantel, reflecting the room as if nothing was wrong. But when I looked closer, I saw her. A woman. Pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that bored into mine. She stood behind me in the reflection, though the room itself was empty. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. No one. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. The next day, I tried to convince myself I was overtired, maybe stressed. I even Googled haunted mirrors and laughed at the absurdity of it all. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I avoided the mirror for the rest of the day. That night, I woke again to the whispering. This time, it was louder, more desperate. Help me. Please. Don't leave me here. I froze. The voice was coming from the mirror. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I approached it. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed and trembling. Who are you? I whispered. The reflection shifted. It wasn't me anymore. The pale woman appeared, her hollow eyes brimming with tears. They're coming, she said. Who's coming? Before she could answer, the room plunged into darkness. My phone light flickered, then died. The temperature dropped, and the air felt heavy, suffocating. Footsteps echoed behind me. Slow, deliberate. I turned, but there was no one there. The following days were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. The whispering continued, always at night, always pleading for help. I started noticing strange things around the house. Lights flickering, objects moving on their own. The worst was the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't mine anymore. Every time I looked, I saw her. Sometimes she just stood there, staring. Other times, she mouthed words I couldn't hear. But every time, her eyes screamed for help. I tried to get rid of the mirror. I drove to the nearest landfill and hurled it into a dumpster, feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt. But when I got home, it was back on the mantel, as if it had never left. I decided to do some digging. The symbols on the frame seemed familiar, and after hours of research, I discovered they were protection runes, old ones, used to trap malevolent spirits. But they weren't working anymore. I found an article about a family that lived in my house in the 1920s. The mother had gone missing, her body never found. The husband, desperate to find her, claimed she had been taken by shadows in the mirror. Everyone dismissed him as insane. He died a year later in the same house. Cause of death: heart attack, though his neighbors claimed they heard screams the night he passed. That night, the whispers turned into screams. I woke to the sound of shattering glass. The mirror was intact, but the windows weren't. The shadows in the room seemed to move, creeping closer. The woman in the mirror was frantic, banging on the glass from her side. "They're here! They're here!" she screamed. The shadows converged, taking shape. Humanoid, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their faces featureless. One of them reached out, its hand passing through the mirror as if it were water. "Run!" the woman screamed. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my car keys and bolted. As I sped down the empty streets, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The shadows were there, chasing me. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town. I pulled into a diner parking lot, my hands shaking. The place was brightly lit, full of people. I thought I was safe. Until I saw the reflection in the diner's window. The shadows were still behind me, watching. Waiting. It's been weeks now. I've tried everything to get rid of the mirror, to escape the shadows. But no matter where I go, they follow. The woman in the mirror is fading, her pleas growing weaker. "They'll take me," she whispered last night. "And then they'll come for you." I don't know how this will end. All I know is that the shadows are getting closer. And the whispers? They're starting to sound like my own voice.
The Watcher in the Woods. Emma's hands were pressed against the cool car window as her family's SUV rumbled down the winding forest road. She watched as the trees blurred into an endless sea of green. Their new home loomed ahead, a Victorian house painted a weathered gray, with shutters that creaked in the breeze. To anyone else, it might have seemed charming, even idyllic. To Emma, it felt off. Her dad parked the car, and Emma reluctantly stepped out. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Her little brother, Max, immediately ran toward the edge of the woods, his laughter echoing through the stillness. Their mom called after him, but he waved her off, too excited to listen. Emma's chest tightened as she looked past him. The forest wasn't inviting, it was vast, dark, and alive with the kind of silence that made you feel like you weren't alone. A sudden chill prickled her skin, even under the warm summer sun. "Home sweet home," her dad said, slinging an arm around her shoulders. Emma forced a smile, but her unease didn't fade. That night, as Emma unpacked her room, she caught herself staring out her window. The trees swayed gently, their shadows spilling across the lawn. Then she saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall and motionless, its body blending unnaturally with the darkness. Emma's throat tightened. "Mom?" she called, her voice trembling. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Her mom came in, her face etched with concern. "What's wrong?" Emma hesitated. "I thought I saw someone in the woods." Her mom frowned. "It's probably just a shadow, honey. You've had a long day. Get some rest." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the figure had been real. The next day, Emma decided to explore the forest, hoping to prove to herself that there was nothing to fear. Camera in hand, she wandered past the towering pines and dense undergrowth. The further she went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. She adjusted her camera lens to capture a sunbeam filtering through the branches. That's when she saw it again. The same tall figure, lurking in the shadows, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. Her heart thundered in her chest. She raised her camera, snapping a photo, but when she looked up, the figure was gone. Back home, Emma reviewed the photos. Her stomach dropped when she saw the last image. The figure was there, blurred, but unmistakable. Its hollow eyes seemed to pierce the screen, staring straight at her. At dinner, Max talked excitedly about his day in the woods. "There's this really cool clearing with stones in a circle," he said between bites of spaghetti. "But it's weird, sometimes I hear whispers, Like someone's talking to me. Emma's fork clattered onto her plate. What kind of whispers? Max shrugged, his carefree expression a stark contrast to her growing dread. Just weird. Like a bunch of voices at once. Their parents laughed it off, dismissing it as Max's overactive imagination. But Emma's hands trembled under the table. She wasn't imagining things, and now she knew Max wasn't either. The next morning, Emma found strange symbols carved into the trees near the woods. Spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that didn't make sense. She ran her fingers over the carvings, their rough edges sending a shiver up her spine. When she showed them to Max, he frowned. "They're probably old," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, and shadows danced across her walls. Then came the sound, soft, deliberate taps on her window. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. A pale hand with impossibly long fingers was pressed against the glass. The rest of the figure was obscured by the darkness, but its presence was undeniable. Emma screamed, and the hand vanished. Her parents rushed in, but when she told them what she'd seen, they blamed it on a nightmare. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma visited the town library. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, grew quiet when Emma mentioned the woods. "Those woods have always been strange," she said, lowering her voice. "In the late 1800s, a man named Silas Grayson lived there. People thought he was unnatural. Children went missing, and they blamed him. But he vanished before he could be tried." Emma's heart sank as the woman continued. "Some say his spirit still lingers, watching from the shadows. They call him the Watcher." Emma's hands shook as she read old newspaper clippings about disappearances near the woods. The victims were always children. That evening, Emma and Max ventured into the woods, armed with flashlights and a vague plan to find answers. The forest felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted their presence. When they reached the clearing Max had mentioned, Emma's breath caught. The stone circle was real, and inside were more carvings, symbols like the ones on the trees. The whispers began, faint at first, then louder. Emma grabbed Max's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could move, the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to shift. From the darkness emerged the Watcher, its impossibly tall frame contorted, its hollow eyes locked onto them. Emma and Max bolted, the whispers chasing them like a rising tide. The forest seemed to close in, branches clawing at their clothes. Emma's lungs burned, her legs aching, but she didn't dare stop. When they burst into their backyard, the whispers ceased. The forest behind them stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. Their parents didn't believe their story, but Emma knew what she had to do. The next day, she returned to the library and found a book on local folklore. It detailed a ritual to banish the Watcher, a cleansing ceremony performed at the stone circle. That night, Emma and Max returned to the clearing with candles, sage, and the ritual instructions. The forest seemed angrier, the air colder. As Emma recited the words, the whispers rose again, drowning out her voice. The Watcher appeared, its figure more monstrous than before. Its hollow eyes seemed to burn with rage, its long fingers reaching toward them. Emma screamed the final words of the ritual, her voice cracking with fear and determination. The Watcher let out a guttural shriek, its form dissolving into a swirling cloud of black smoke. The air grew still. In the days that followed, the house felt lighter, the woods less foreboding. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the Watcher wasn't truly gone. Late at night, she still found herself staring out her window, her eyes drawn to the forest. And sometimes, just sometimes, she thought she saw a shadow standing at the tree line.
The Whispering Woods. Sometimes, the things we fear most are not the things we see but the things we hear. This story will remind you to trust your instincts, even when logic tells you otherwise. So, settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a tale of dread, The Whispering Woods. Sarah, a 32-year-old freelance writer from Boston, had been feeling burned out. Her therapist suggested a change of scenery, so she rented a secluded cabin in the heart of Red Pines, a dense forest renowned for its beauty but also whispered to have a dark past. The locals spoke in hushed tones about people who ventured too deep into the woods and never returned. Sarah dismissed the stories as small-town folklore and focused on her goal, to find inspiration for her next big story. As Sarah unpacked her things in the rustic, creaky cabin, a strange unease settled over her. The cabin's air was thick, heavy. Act 2, the first night. Sarah tried to shake off the feeling of unease as she lit a fire in the stone hearth. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, staring out at the vast expanse of towering pine trees. The world outside was eerily silent, with only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the stillness. As she began to jot down ideas in her notebook, a faint whisper broke the quiet. It sounded like her name. Sarah. She froze, her pen hovering above the page. "Did I imagine that?" she muttered, shaking her head. Her heart raced, but she convinced herself it was the wind. After all, she was in the middle of a forest. Later that night, as she lay in bed, the whispers returned. This time, they were clearer, almost playful. "Come find me, Sarah. Don't you want to know the truth?" Her blood ran cold. She bolted upright, her eyes scanning the dark room. "Hello? Is someone there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The next morning, Sarah found herself unable to focus on her writing. The whispers from the night before lingered in her mind. Against her better judgment, she decided to explore the forest, hoping a walk would clear her head. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the towering pines seemed to close in around her. The air grew colder, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy. About an hour into her walk, Sarah came across an old, abandoned campsite. A rusted lantern hung from a low branch, and a tattered journal lay half-buried in the dirt. Curious, she picked up the journal and flipped through its pages. The entries were erratic, filled with frantic scrawls about the whispers and a shadow with no form. The last entry sent chills down her spine. "If you're reading this, it's too late. It knows you now. It's in the whispers. Don't listen." Sarah dropped the journal and took a shaky step back. Suddenly, a sharp snap echoed through the woods, a twig breaking underfoot. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. No one was there. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder now, circling her cabin like a predator stalking its prey. "Sarah! Why do you run? You can't escape me." She clutched the blanket to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "What do you want from me?" she screamed. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I want you to see." The room plunged into darkness, the fire in the hearth snuffed out in an instant. Sarah's breath came in short, panicked gasps as a shadowy figure emerged from the corner of the room. It had no discernible form, just an ever-shifting mass of darkness. The figure moved closer, and Sarah's body froze. She couldn't scream, couldn't move, she could only watch as the entity leaned in, its voice a low hiss. "The truth lies in the woods. Go. Or stay and perish." Driven by terror, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and bolted out of the cabin. The forest was alive with sound now, the whispers louder than ever, guiding her deeper and deeper into the woods. She stumbled upon a clearing where a massive, ancient tree stood. Its bark was blackened, and its gnarled branches twisted upward like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree was a mound of disturbed earth, as if something, or someone, had been buried there. As Sarah approached, the whispers stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Then, she saw them, faces. Dozens of ghostly faces appeared in the bark of the tree, their mouths open in silent screams. "Help us," they whispered in unison. Sarah fell to her knees, her mind racing. The tree wasn't just a tree, it was a prison for souls, victims of the entity that had lured her here. The ground beneath her began to shake, and the shadowy figure appeared once more. "You wanted inspiration, Sarah. Now you have it," it growled. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Sarah scrambled to her feet and ran. The whispers chased her, growing louder and more frantic. You can't escape. You're mine now." The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around her. Just when she thought she couldn't run any farther, she saw the faint glow of her cabin's porch light in the distance. Bursting through the door, she slammed it shut and collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The whispers stopped, and for the first time in hours, there was silence. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. The entity had let her go, for now. Sarah left Red Pines the next morning, abandoning the cabin and everything she had brought with her. She returned to Boston, but the experience changed her forever. Her latest novel, The Whispering Woods, became a bestseller. Critics praised its vivid imagery and haunting realism, but Sarah knew the truth. The inspiration for her story had come at a price. And sometimes, late at night, she still hears the whispers. "Sarah. We're still here."